The plane disappears into the night sky, leaving nothing behind but silence. Below, the land is dark, frozen, and occupied. This is not just enemy territory. This is home, taken. Two figures drift downward through the cold air, their parachutes barely visible against the snow. They hit the ground harder than expected, stumbling as they land, disoriented and alone. The drop was wrong. The timing was wrong. Already, the mission is slipping off script. But there is no turning back. Somewhere not far from here lives a man whose power reaches across Europe. A man who has built systems of fear, organized death on an industrial scale, and helped shape one of the most brutal regimes in human history. Reinhard Heydrich. He wakes up this morning believing he controls everything. He has no idea that two men have just arrived to kill him. If you enjoy history told like this, subscribe because this story only gets darker. Reinhard Heydrich did not simply rise through the Nazi ranks, he cut his way upward with precision. There was something unsettling about him. On the surface, he looked exactly like what the regime wanted the world to see. Disciplined, composed, physically imposing. He carried himself with confidence, spoke with authority, and moved with the quiet certainty of someone who believed he belonged at the top. But those who worked around him understood something else. He was efficient in a way that removed hesitation. Where others debated, he acted. Where others followed orders, he structured systems. He did not just participate in the machinery of Nazi power, he helped design it. By the late 1930s, he controlled intelligence networks and secret police operations across the Reich. When violence broke out during Kristallnacht, it was not spontaneous chaos. It was coordinated, directed, organized. And when the regime began turning towards something far darker, something systematic, Heydrich was placed at the center of it. In 1941, he was tasked with coordinating the final solution, not just enforcing policy, planning it, turning ideology into logistics, turning hatred into a system that could operate across an entire continent. That is why he mattered. That is why he became a target. When Heydrich arrived in Prague, the city was already under occupation, but not fully broken. There were still whispers of resistance, quiet acts of defiance, a sense that the occupation, while real, was not permanent. Heydrich ended that illusion quickly. Within weeks, arrests increased. People disappeared overnight. Names were taken from lists. Workers who resisted were punished, deported, or executed. Entire networks were dismantled before they could act. It was not random brutality. It was deliberate pressure. Enough violence to create fear. Enough control to maintain order. Factories increased production for the German war effort. Public resistance faded. The streets grew quieter. From the outside, it looked like stability. But beneath that silence, resentment hardened. People remembered. And far beyond Prague, others were watching. In London, the Czech government had nothing left to defend, except the idea that their country still existed. They had lost their territory. Their army had been scattered. Their people were living under occupation. And without visible resistance, the world might begin to believe that nothing was happening, that the Czech people had accepted defeat. They needed to prove otherwise. Not with speeches. Not with small acts of sabotage. With something that could not be ignored. So they made a decision that would change everything. They would strike directly at the Nazi leadership. They would kill Reinhard Heydrich. The mission would be called Operation Anthropoid. And for it, they chose two men who understood exactly what was at stake. Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubis. They were not chosen because they were the strongest or the fastest. They were chosen because they would not turn away. Part 4. Nothing goes as planned. The drop was supposed to be precise. Instead, it was chaos. Snow blinded the pilots. Landmarks disappeared beneath white. The timing slipped. The location shifted. When the men hit the ground, they knew immediately that something had gone wrong. They were not where they were supposed to be. They were closer to Prague than planned, and farther from their contacts. Gabčík's leg was injured during the landing. Not enough to stop him, but enough to slow him. Enough to matter. They buried their parachutes in the snow and moved quickly, trying to orient themselves in the dark. At this stage, the mission should have been reconsidered. They were in the wrong place. One of them was injured. Their support network was uncertain. But they did not reconsider. Because they understood something simple. If they stopped now, nothing would change. So they kept going. The mission survived because of people whose names are rarely remembered. Families who opened their homes. Workers who passed along information. Members of the underground who risked everything to keep the operation alive. These were not soldiers. They had no weapons, no training, no protection. But they understood the risk. If the Nazis found out, they would not just be punished. They would be erased. Entire households could disappear for helping two men. And still they helped. Over weeks and months, the assassins moved between safe houses, slowly building the network they needed. Meanwhile, Heydrich continued his life without interruption. He traveled openly, confidently, often without escort, because from his perspective, the situation was under control. That confidence created the opening. The plan was not rushed. It was built carefully, piece by piece. They studied his movements, his routines, the routes he took through the city, where he slowed down, where he was exposed. Several options were considered. An attack at his residence was impossible, too many guards. An attack in a crowded area risked failure. But one detail stood out. Every day, Heydrich traveled by car along the same route. At one particular bend in the road, the car slowed significantly. That was the moment. That was where they would strike. And so they waited, day after day, watching, memorizing, preparing, until the moment arrived. On the morning of May 27, 1942, the city felt ordinary. People moved through their routines. The streets were quiet. Nothing suggested that within minutes, everything would change. The assassins took their positions. They had done this before, rehearsing in their minds, calculating timing, visualizing every movement. Then Heydrich's car appeared. Everything slowed. Gabsik stepped forward, raised his weapon, and pulled the trigger. And nothing happened. The gun jammed. In that instant, the entire mission collapsed. Months of planning, undone by a mechanical failure. Heydrich reacted immediately, rising from his seat, drawing his weapon, ready to fight. For a moment, it looked like the assassins would die in the street. But Kubis moved. He threw the explosive. It detonated beside the car, sending shrapnel through the vehicle. The street filled with smoke, debris, confusion. And then it was over. The assassins were gone. Heydrich was alive, but not unharmed. For days after the attack, no one knew how it would end. Heydrich had survived the explosion. He was conscious when he was taken from the scene, still giving orders, still fully aware of what had just happened. That alone was enough to shake the assassins' confidence. They had risked everything for a single moment, and now it seemed like that moment might not be enough. At the hospital in Prague, doctors worked quickly to stabilize him. Shrapnel had torn into his side, damaging his organs, but the wounds did not appear immediately fatal. Surgery was performed. The fragments were removed. His condition, at least at first, seemed to improve. Inside the Nazi leadership, there was cautious optimism. Reports circulated that Heydrich would recover, that he would return to his post, that the attack had failed. And as that belief spread, so did something else. The search. The Gestapo flooded the streets, interrogating civilians, checking documents, raiding homes. Roadblocks appeared overnight. Informants were activated. Every lead, no matter how small, was pursued. The city tightened under pressure, as if it were being slowly squeezed. Meanwhile, Heydrich remained in his hospital bed, under constant watch. For a brief moment, it seemed as though he had escaped death. But something had been missed. In the days following the surgery, his condition began to change. At first, it was subtle, a fever, signs of fatigue. Then the symptoms grew worse. The wounds that had seemed controlled began to turn against him. Infection had set in. Without modern antibiotics, there was little that could be done. The doctors tried to manage it, but the damage was already spreading through his body. His strength faded. His condition deteriorated rapidly. What had looked like survival slowly transformed into something else. Inevitable decline. On June 4, 1942, 8 days after the attack, Reinhard Heydrich died. The news spread quickly. For the assassins, it meant something they had not allowed themselves to fully believe. The mission had worked. One of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, a key architect of terror, was gone. But that realization did not bring relief. Because even before the confirmation reached them, the consequences had already begun. The regime did not see this as a loss. It saw it as a challenge. And its response would not be measured. It would be absolute. What followed was not justice. It was retaliation. And it would fall not on the assassins first, but on the people who had no way to escape it. The Nazi response did not come slowly. It came all at once. Within hours of Heydrich's death, orders were issued from the highest levels of the regime. This was not going to be treated as a simple assassination. It was not even going to be treated as a military act. It was going to be turned into a warning, not just to Prague, not just to the Czech resistance, but to all of occupied Europe. The goal was not justice. There would be no investigation in the traditional sense, no careful search for those directly responsible. What they wanted was something far more powerful. Fear. The kind of fear that lingers long after the event itself. The kind that makes people think twice before helping, before speaking, before even hoping. And to create that fear, they needed something visible. Something undeniable. So they chose a village. Lidice. It was small, quiet, ordinary in every way. Families lived there, worked there, raised children there. It had no real strategic importance, no defenses, no way to resist what was coming. There was no clear proof that the people of Lidice had anything to do with the assassination. But that was never the point. In the early hours of June 10, 1942, the village was surrounded. No one was allowed to leave. No one was allowed to enter. The operation was precise, controlled, almost methodical, as if it had been rehearsed. At dawn, the villagers were forced from their homes. Men, women, and children were separated. The men were taken aside first. They were lined up in groups, brought to a nearby area, and executed. Not in chaos, not in anger, but in a cold, repeated process that continued until there was no one left. The women were not killed on the spot. They were transported away, sent to concentration camps, where survival was uncertain and suffering was guaranteed. The children faced a different fate. A small number were selected, those the Nazis believed could be re-educated, forced into German families, stripped of their identity. The rest were taken away. Most would never be seen again. And then, after the people were gone, the village itself was erased. Homes were set on fire one by one, until nothing remained but ash and smoke. Buildings that had stood for generations disappeared in a matter of hours. Even the cemetery was not spared. Graves were dug up. Markers removed. As if the people who had lived there had never existed at all. Roads were altered. The landscape reshaped. The name Lidice was ordered to be removed from maps, from records, from memory. This was not destruction in the heat of war. It was deliberate erasure. A statement written in fire and silence. And the message was unmistakable. Not spoken, not written, but understood by everyone who heard what had happened. This is what resistance costs. For a time, the assassins remained hidden. But pressure was building. The Nazis expanded their search, interrogating anyone suspected of involvement. Eventually, someone broke. Information was given. Locations revealed. The network collapsed. The final hiding place, a church, was surrounded. Inside, the assassins and their companions prepared for what they knew was coming. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. The battle that followed was not about escape. It was about refusal. Refusal to surrender. Refusal to be captured. Refusal to let the mission end quietly. When the Nazis could not break through, they flooded the crypt. Water filled the space. The defenders fought until there was nothing left. And then, one by one, they chose their own end. The assassination of Reinhard Heydrich did not stop the war. It did not end the regime. It did not prevent further atrocities. But it proved something that mattered. That even in a system built on fear, there were still those willing to resist it, at any cost. And that sometimes, history is not changed by armies, but but by a few people who refuse to accept what the world has become.